welcome to the D3D4 Football Podcast with me, your host, James Richards. Hello everyone, welcome back to a D3D4 Football Podcast Extra. Today's podcast is going to be talking about football finance. And the reason we've sort of got this podcast together is because, as you well know, the current global pandemic has put, as one EFL chairman has put it, up to a dozen EFL clubs potentially on the brink of bankruptcy, to quote his own words. And it's quite worrying times. But there is a need, I think everyone will agree, a need to change the way football finances itself. The lower league clubs are continually being left behind as the current structure sees more and more money float to the top clubs in the Premier League. And even in the Championship as well, with the parachute payments. And there is a plan, and there is a man with a plan, and that man is the MP for Folkestone and Hythe. It's Damian Collins. And Damian, thank you for joining us on this podcast to talk through it.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome. I'm also joined by football writer and blogger Peter Taylor, known for his website Bury Me in Exile. Peter, thank you for coming on board today.
No worries, James. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I think it'll be a unique insight from yourself, what it's like to lose a club. And I think the idea of any change in football financial structures would be to never see that happen again. So, and our final guest is football historian and author and long-standing member of the Supporters Trust at Reading, Roger Titford. Roger, thank you again for agreeing to join us today.
Hello, James. Very welcome.
So, Damon, let me ask you first of all, as we get into this, a bit about yourself. So if you could, our listeners may not know of you, they may not be aware of why you have put together this plan. So if you could just give us a bit of background about how it came about and why it's important to you.
Yes, I mean, I've been a Member of Parliament for 10 years, and I came into Parliament as a football fan. But I think, like a lot of football fans, before I became an MP, not probably knowing a huge amount about the finances of football, the governance of football, some of the problems that were there. And then when I was first elected, I became a member of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, and we did an inquiry in 2011 into football governance. And for me, that was a real eye-opener into some of the issues around the financial regulation of the game, the lack of oversight, the real genuine frustrations fans had when watching a bad owner run their club into the ground. I also, around that time, was also very heavily involved in a campaign called New FIFA Now, which was focused on exposing corruption at FIFA and calling for reform of FIFA and the way the global game was governed. Then subsequently, I became chairman of the DCMS Select Committee, and we continued to look at issues to do with sports governance whilst I was chairman as well. So over the last 10 years, I've done in Parliament a lot of work looking at issues to do with the way football is being run, challenging aspects of that. And so in thinking about what football needs now and the sort of reforms that might be in place now, it's really built on, for me, that work over the previous 10 years.
Brilliant. So with all this work you've done over the last 10 years, what specifically about the problems in football as it stands right now do you think we need to address pretty urgently?
Yeah, So my frustration in that position is that over the last 10 years, we've looked at this a lot. We've made a lot of recommendations, which I'll talk about, and in particular the ones in our most recent proposal. I've not only been in a position to do anything about it, I've not been a government minister, not had ministerial responsibility. And indeed, football has always really existed as a kind of really run as a private competition, outside of government, outside of the purview of the Minister of Sport. And the only real lever the government has and Parliament has when working with football is money. Now, for the very big clubs in the Premier League, they're largely financially self-sufficient, with some exceptions, and therefore that lever isn't easy to pull. But with the Football League, it can be, and I think it creates an opportunity now, but it also gets to the root of the problem. In that, when you boil it down, football in this country is not really run by the Football Association, although they are responsible for the rules of the game. It is run by the chairman of the clubs. And that when you look at a body like the Football League, just like the Premier League, it is a private club run by the 72 chairmen of that competition. And despite the rules and regulations that are put in place to try and make sure they're run in a financially sustainable way, that bad owners are kept out, those rules are not enforced as they should be, because ultimately the people that own those clubs are not that interested in that level of strict oversight. But what they are interested in is often punishing clubs that have got into administration, got into financial difficulty the last minute, and kicking them out of the competition, as happened to Bury. And this is not a sustainable way to run a football competition. There needs to be much tougher oversight, particularly of the money the clubs spend on salaries and players, proper enforcement of the owners and directors test so that people that shouldn't be involved in running a club are not allowed to take over a club. Then I think we would have a much better position. Football would have been, with the rules football has already properly enforced, football would have been in a much more robust position going into a crisis like the one we're in now. But we've gone into it with many clubs already very financially distressed, and coronavirus and being in a position where they can't play matches in front of fans will be the last straw for many of them. But it's that lack of proper enforcement of the rules and the weak oversight which has allowed football clubs to get into the state they're in today.
No, I quite agree, actually. And I might bring in a point made by the Walsall podcast, who, as you well know, Walsall are a club that do tend to be quite strict with the way that they spend their money. And the guy from One Pod Beyond said, one question I'd really like to ask is why hasn't the SCMP been enforced with more clubs in an effort to stop them spending 100% plus of revenue on wages? And actually, an EFL chairman did come back to me about this. And he said it is enforced, but in League One it allows owners to inject as much cash as they want. It is therefore very much within the SCMP rules that Fleetwood, for example, can incur a loss of £6 million on a turnover of £5.5 million and fund it with £17 million of loans from the chairman's companies. He said the rules are the problem, not the enforcement, but he thinks that things will be different when salary caps are hopefully introduced. So that kind of backs up what you have just said. That in fact, if the rules that are currently there are enforced properly, and you close these kind of loopholes where chairmen are just allowed to pump as much money in as they like, then football would be better able to absorb a crisis that we're seeing at the moment. But actually, they aren't. And I think it was the Tranmere chairman who did point out that there are serious questions about up to a dozen clubs. And in fact, in the last 2 seasons, we've seen HMRC issue winding up petitions to the likes of Macclesfield, Bury, Oxford, Southend, Oldham, and probably a few more that I haven't mentioned, and it's a worrying time. So, to bring in your plan then, what exactly do you propose, and how do you propose to get it accepted by football if the chairman are the ones currently running the game?
Sure. So the plan is based on a proposal to provide financial support for clubs in distress due to coronavirus. And the reason we published it a couple of weeks ago when we did was that we think we're now entering the period where, particularly for clubs in League One and League Two, that this is going to be it's going to start to get much more difficult. The clubs have largely been advanced money from next season to keep them going towards the end of this season. They're going to be very reliant now on the goodwill of the fans in buying season tickets for next season, even though next season doesn't have a start date, because that money helps keep clubs going, as you know, during the closed season. But even if club fans do, in good faith, still buy those tickets, there's a danger that the clubs will still get a hit on other monies they might have got from advertisers or pre-selling matchday hospitality and things like that. So the summer's going to be very hard. And with no imminent prospect of playing in front of spectators, even when the season restarts, that's going to be a problem. And in fact, the season restarting in Leagues 1 and League 2 without spectators, I think many of the clubs would argue against, because that would simply be they'd be playing games at a loss that they couldn't sustain. So I think there's a moment of funding crisis now. The financial support the government has put in place for most other businesses largely don't apply to football clubs. And indeed, some of the banks have said that even for the larger coronavirus loans that they could advance to some businesses, they won't do to football clubs because they regard those clubs as businesses already in difficulty. So the public measures that have been put in place, I don't think are going to help clubs. The traditional route of seeking additional investment from a club owner may be difficult because the other businesses of that club owner may be in distress. Seeking new investors could be hard because investing into a football club that may already be running at a substantial loss and has got no prospect of any income for the foreseeable future is not going to be very attractive for a new investor as well. So if that means that the only place clubs can go for support, just as rugby league has already done, is to the government, then that creates an opportunity. I don't think that if public money is used to help football clubs that need it, that money should be given without any strings attached. And I think it creates an opportunity then to say, well, this money can go to a club to help bail them out. But with that, we want proper oversight of the way this club is being run. We want to appoint independent directors to that club's board who will have access to real-time financial information to make sure the club is being run within the rules of the league, within the financial rules that have been set. And if it's not, then those independent directors can blow the whistle. What we've suggested alongside this idea of issuing financial support in terms for shares in the club is that this financial support is given by a new financial regulator, a football finance authority, that the money in this authority would come from the government and maybe some of the football bodies and authorities, maybe the Premier League as well, in the same way the Football Foundation is funded by those joint sources of income. That the financial authority would be responsible for agreeing who the independent directors can be, and it would be the body the directors went to if they wanted to blow the whistle to say there was a problem. So through this, for clubs in this scheme, their financial oversight would no longer be done by the league as such, but principally by this new authority, an independent body that could make sure there was real rigour to the way the finances of the club were being applied. We've then suggested as a mechanism by which the public funds spent on this scheme could be recovered, is that the minority stakes in the clubs that may have been bought through accessing this finance scheme could then later be acquired by the community, either by a recognised supporters trust or perhaps even by the local authority. That would then give the community on a permanent basis a real stake in the running of the club, a real insight into the finances of the club, and may create an opportunity to ensure the clubs are run on a much more sustainable level for the future. So the idea is that the finances the clubs need now, but with strings attached, that being oversight, and then the prospect of community ownership in the future. That's the sort of the three elements of the package we put forward. But you say, why would the Football League accept it? Because whenever we've challenged the Football League over things like the football creditors rule or the lack of proper enforcement of the owners and directors test and things like that, the clubs would push back and said, ultimately, this is a private club and we can do what we like. But there may well be nowhere else they can go for financial support. And that, I think, creates the opportunity to say that support can come, but with it will come lasting reform of the way football finances work.
Okay, that's the proposal, as we say, sound very reasonable. However, getting the support of clubs has been already problematic because a number of chairmen of clubs have said to me that a number of MPs put their name to this proposal without any consultation of the clubs, and in fact were almost saying they were speaking on behalf of the clubs. I mean, I know in particular Shrewsbury Town were upset about this. What's your response to that? Because it kind of does need the support of the clubs themselves to get off the ground.
Well, what we said in the letter that was signed by, there have been two phases to this. I wrote with Charlie Matthew in a kind of like a manifesto, a long sort of statement, which set out the ideas behind this. And then following that, there was a letter sent to the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, Oliver Dowden, Greg Clark, the chairman of the FA, and Rick Parry at the Football League. And what that said was it took the 6 points of our plan and said we asked the Secretary of State to convene urgent talks with the football authorities to discuss a rescue plan for football based on those 6 principles. So the idea is they would be the starting point for those discussions. And it was certainly never intended to suggest that the MPs individually were signing on behalf of the clubs, but just that they were MPs who got Football League clubs in their constituencies, and therefore as concerned members of Parliament, they were supporting the principle that there should be government support for a financial rescue package for football and a plan. And I think I raised this in the House of Commons last week on the floor of the House. And the urgent crisis we have now is there is no plan. The football authorities haven't got a plan. The government doesn't have a plan. There is no plan at the moment to come to the aid of a Football League club that goes into administration with no prospect of any finance to rescue it. And that's the urgent crisis that we need to resolve. Now, I appreciate club chairmen and other people in football may have different views about that plan, but I think what everyone will probably agree is if we want these competitions to resume and for football post-corona to resemble what it looks like at the moment, there's got to be a plan. And at the moment, there isn't one.
Well, indeed. And Tom Lyons, who actually hosts the Walsall podcast, the One Pod Beyond, he said, as much as I like the idea of Walsall, Shrewsbury, Exeter and AFC Wimbledon playing each other 6 times a season in League One for well-run clubs, is this not an existential crisis for all of us? I mean, can any of us survive with no gate money until 2021? I think he has a point.
And also, I think with owners, I think if we had competitions that were run in a sustainable way, where a club chairman knows that who's running their club in a responsible way is not having to compete against a club that is massively gambling on future success by hugely overspending, then I think actually clubs, I think we would attract better owners in football as well. It would not be seen as such a precarious and risky business, but actually something that's sustainable, and that a club, you don't own a football club to make profit every season out of it, but you run it to make sure it's there for the future and there for the community. And I think the interesting thing for clubs in League One and League Two in particular is what this crisis demonstrates is they are community clubs, because if they can't play in front of their fans, they don't really exist. And therefore I think it's time to strengthen those links back into the community. And I think for too long communities have felt shut out of the way their clubs are run.
I think it might be a good point to bring to Roger Titford now, because Roger, Reading are well known to currently be spending 225% of their turnover on wages, or income on wages, and it's not going down well with the supporters. What is the supporters' trust at Reading's take on this?
We're in favour of this. The strange thing with our owner is not that he's short of money, it would seem, but he's short of the ability to spend the money, and is constrained by financial fair play from putting more in. So we're in a rather odd circumstance there. But clearly, to be spending twice as much on wages as your revenue is not something that any club should be doing. And I think supporters are not particularly pleased with the wages paid or the signings made over the last year or two. In a more general sense, I'd be interested, Damian, on what you see as the path towards creating the Football Finance Authority. You know, if you get Secretary of State Oliver Dowden, who I don't think is a noted football fan, on board with the idea, where do we go from there in order to get it up and running in time to save these dozen clubs that may be on the brink come October, November?
Well, I think what will happen first is there will be, I think the government needs to resolve with the football authorities how much money that people are going to commit to supporting clubs, creating a fund to support clubs. I mean, Rick Parry said he thought the Football League would need about £200 million. So let's say arguably that's the amount of money. Where's that money going to come from? I think the government will probably be the lender of last resort, but I think there probably should be some contribution from the Premier League and the football authorities. I don't think they probably are in a position to fund all of that, but that's the first decision that needs to be made urgently is, okay, where's the finance going to come from?
Right.
And then the second thing is just to determine that the financial support given to clubs that apply for it will come in the form of an equity share rather than a loan. I think that's a good idea because I'm not sure these loans would ever be repaid, and therefore it gives a stake in the club. And then with that agreement should come the right for independent directors to be appointed. Now, the architecture of the authority could evolve over time, as on a case-by-case basis this financial support is given. And indeed, I mean, if this was to be very widespread and we reached a position where a significant number of Football League clubs had received support in whole or in part in this way, then of course it may even be that the league's rules may even change to reflect that if that's what the clubs wanted. But in the short term, it would be, I think it's simply a question of setting up the fund, setting the rules, access to that fund, and the appointment of the independent directors. That's the first step, and making sure those directors have access to real-time financial records to make sure the clubs are being run properly within the rules of the Football League.
How would you appoint the directors? Because I think there was a scrutiny from some people saying, what qualifications would these independent directors need to have to scrutinise football club accounts and to sit on the board and be part of running that football club? Because they would have to have confidence. I think fans would have to have confidence in those independent directors' ability to do the job at hand.
Well, I think we suggested that the directors could be nominated. When nominated, would have to be approved by this financial authority. I think the immediate requirement should be that they would at least pass the owners and directors test. And we know there are a number of people who've taken over football clubs, Bury being one of them, where the owner wasn't subjected to that test. So I think at least for the authority to make sure that test is properly enforced by people coming forward to be these directors might mean that these independent directors are more qualified than some of the people that currently run clubs.
Yeah, I think a lot of fans would probably agree with that. But one thing I would say, and bringing Peter on this one, is that if this fund did indeed exist, then there would have been no need, I think, for the EFL to ratify Steve Dale's chairmanship or ownership of Bury in such haste, because the immediacy of their financial crash left them right on the brink very quickly. Peter, what is your thoughts on this plan as a fan who has seen his club disappear in front of his eyes?
Kind of mixed in a way. Mixed only because, obviously, as a fan of Bury, it's too late for the club, but it's kind of been a long time coming. I would say nearly 30 years, ever since the breakaway of the Premier League in 1992. It's just been a very slow sort of trundle along, and then obviously certain events happened along the way, like ITV Digital collapse and the current crisis too. But it's been a long time coming, so to have this sort of proposal put forward, is it absolutely perfect? No. Is it? But is it probably workable? Yes. Have I seen any better counter proposals put forward by anyone? I have to say no at the moment. So it's good to have someone with a keen eye on it, who did chair the DCMS committee, who has a good interest for a couple of years at least on this, and particularly to put forward it. Does, in a way, government involvement in football? No, it's not. In principle, it doesn't sound great, but you look at the governance, and going back to the first point, the governance of the EFL, the governance of the game as a whole, has just not been fit for purpose either. Now, yes, individual owners, particularly of Bury and some other clubs like Macclesfield, not been up to scratch and all that, but it was partly because of the supine sort of lack of governance from the EFL in the first place, and other leagues too. And it's just not been really any overarching, any linked up thinking within English football as a whole anyway. So if this proposal sort of bridged a few of those gaps, then I think it has to be welcomed.
I think a lot of fans would agree with that. I think a lot of fans would be looking at something like this as a welcome safety net. And indeed, Damian, it is a safety net, because, of course, if a club is well run, they would never have to get involved with the FFA at all, of course.
That's right. And also, we'd want this bailout and financial support, I think, to come with strings attached, as I said earlier on. So, because I think if the clubs were just given money, let's say a long-term loan from the government, a very low interest rate, without the sort of financial oversight we talked about, I think we know what will happen, is the money will just be spent. And then the clubs will come back 6 months later, a year later, and ask for some more. So I think if the government's going to take this unusual step of seeking to sort of provide financial security to a football club, it should do so, I think, with a requirement that club trades responsibly and within the rules in the future.
And do you think there is a will within the government to do this? Because, of course, using public funds to prop up football at a time when lots of people could be potentially losing their jobs, it may not be something that gets public support outside of the football fandom itself.
Well, that's why I think the idea of how much money do we think we need and where's it going to come from, those questions are the ones that need to be answered now. Because I asked the Secretary of State about this in questions in Parliament last week, and his answer there was he basically expected the support for football to come from within football. But if that wasn't possible, then he was discussing things further with the football authorities. There seems to be my sense is there seems to be an assumption within government that the Premier League will bail out the rest of football, but I don't think there is any plan at the moment to do that. I've spoken to people at different Premier League clubs who say they're not aware of any plan that's been circulated amongst them for them to sign off. And certainly, if what was reported in the press a few weeks ago that the £200 million fund was going to be created by each Premier League club putting in £10 million, that's certainly a surprise to some of them. And some of them said they don't think they ever could or would do that. So I think this needs to be bottomed out, because my concern at the moment is what will happen is there'll suddenly be the first 2, 3, 4 clubs that will come along in distress, seeking help. They'll go to the Football League and won't be able to give it. And they won't be able to find the money anywhere else, and we'll be in a crisis. And that could be avoided by putting a plan in place now. And the first brick in that wall has got to be deciding how much money is needed and where it's going to come from.
My other question would be, if a chairman, for example, at a club who maybe not have the club's long-term interests at heart, if he sees an opportunity to spend a bit more money in a season to try and go for glory, would it be risky, therefore, to have this safety net for him to fall back on? Because you might get some chairman, and I hope this isn't the case, but you might get someone to go a bit blasé with their attitude, go, well, it doesn't matter if we spend big this season, because if we do get in trouble, we can just fall back on the government, and they'll pay the debts.
Well, that raises an interesting question about the proposals we put forward, which is that we'd envisage it being a minority stake, so less than half of the shares of the club. So the existing owners would maintain control. It would beg the question in the future, if more financial support was needed, is whether actually in that case the owners would have to give up control of the club, which would be it's a disincentive for them, because it's not just soft loans, it's not a bailout. They are with each deal that's done, they are giving up part of the ownership of the club, and ultimately that could then lead to the club coming under community control ultimately. Which may be a good thing for some of those clubs in the long run. But that's why I think the oversight and the controls we've suggested are important, so that the money comes with strings attached. And we've also suggested that it should be the job of the Football Finance Authority to make sure not only that the club's trading within the league's rules, particularly on the salary protocol for players, but that also the money given to support the club in this way is being used to restructure the finances of the club. It's not to be used for signing new players or to creating or carrying out anything other than essential repairs to the ground.
It does sound like it's very workable. I mean, there are other chairmen within the game who would say, actually, the current rules of the game, though, need to be changed in line with any new creation of an FFA, because they have all these loopholes which allow ludicrous amounts of spending, as I gave the example of an EFL chairman earlier on. I mean, do you think that this new proposal would work unless there were rule changes within the current structure of the EFL that allowed this ridiculous amount of spending beyond, for example, a club's turnover?
I think this is an important point, because I think the issue of club chairman's loans or investors' loans to clubs to get around the rules is an issue, because also there's no guarantee in using that money in that way to sign players on contracts. Of course, those contracts have to be honoured in full, and there's no guarantee that the chairman will necessarily be able to continue putting the loans in. So that's one of the ways in which clubs become unstable, and I do have concerns about that. I do think there is an issue though about enforcement, because I know in the case of Bury, I saw the accounts for the I think it was the 2017-18 financial year, the year before the club went bust. Now those accounts have never been signed off. They've not been published. They were given to us by someone who had access to them to inform the select committee's work when we looked at Bury just before the general election was called. But they've never been submitted. So how could the Football League know for definite what the true financial position of the club was? Because it doesn't have access to that information. And my understanding is that in the figures that the clubs do give to the league, they are often estimates based in part on loans, in part on massively optimistic predictions in terms of gate receipts, success in cup competitions, and so on. Because during the course of the season, it's very difficult to know. I think part of the problem has been not only that the club chairman are not that interested in financial oversight, because one day it may bite them. Not all the chairmen, but some of them I think are in that category. And that creates a problem. But also the Football League is principally just interested in clubs finishing the season. And I think we saw this with Bury. I think a lot of fans, and Bolton as well, a lot of fans were rightly raised the question when their club gets into deep, deep trouble. Why wasn't something done before it got this bad? And I think the problem there is that the league only intervenes if it looks like the club can't complete the season, and largely wants the club to complete the season. But in the closed season, it may take a much tougher stance because it's worried about letting them start again if it doesn't think they can finish. And it just shows that the intervention that comes, when it does come, comes when it's almost too late. And unless a white knight comes along who's prepared to bail the club out, then the club will go bust. And I think looking at the economic situation we're in at the moment, I think there are not going to be very many people that are going to be in that position or would take the risk of buying a club that's got no revenue.
No, I think you're quite right on that point. Not many people will have the amount of money needed to rescue some of the clubs in their current financial situations. I mean, Roger, is there anything else you want to say on this regarding from a supporters trust point of view and how this would, you think, be a benefit to fans?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like it was almost a philosophical question, Damien, that the traditional argument against your kind of proposal that I've heard from Conservative MPs in the past is that it would be interfering in the running of a private business. The fans' argument has always been a football club isn't just a business, it's a cultural and community asset like a stately home. How far do you think you are in winning the philosophical argument within your own party and Parliament in general that football clubs should be treated differently from just another private business?
Well, I think they already are. I mean, the Localism Act that was passed in 2011, that had a schedule of community assets, including pubs and things like that, and football grounds were included in that as well, where there could be community right to buy those assets as assets of community value, and indeed local authorities have powers to prevent the sort of the loss of a football ground that has special powers that don't exist for other businesses. We tend not to let clubs normally in business, businesses merge. They acquire other businesses and they merge together, and that doesn't happen in football. The legals prevent that. And the FA takes a view as well through the FA Council on certain important cultural aspects of football, to do with the name of the club, the colours that they play in, things like that the FA Council can get involved in too. So there are already all sorts of sort of covenants in place to try and protect the community value of a football club and recognise that they're not just any other business. They have an intrinsic community value as well. So I think that case has already been advanced. And I think there's also a broader debate in government at the moment, which has been reported saying that, actually, rather than the government just handing out loans, which businesses may find difficult to repay, that actually the idea of the government taking equity stakes in businesses as a mechanism for providing financial support could be a better scheme. So that's a debate that's already being had. So I think I think we're also about to go into potentially the greatest economic shock, the steepest decline in GDP that we've seen, in the industrial era. So I think that will require new solutions to help businesses through this time, and businesses that are reliant on footfall, on sort of people going to experience it live, go and see them live, perform, and for whom that is their principal source of income. Those are businesses that are going to be particularly vulnerable. I was interested in the Financial Times a few days ago. Sam Mendes proposed a scheme to support theatre and theatre production, which was a bit different from this one, but again suggested that the government should act like an angel investor in productions and theatres, just as private investors do at the moment, and seek to sort of recover their investment if they back a winner, just as private investors do. And that may be, because there may be a shortage of cash that can be invested in this way, the government may need to step up in that way. So I think some of these ideas are not that out of step with things other people are talking about at the moment.
No, that's good. That's progress in a number of fronts. So, having put an asset of community value on the Medeski Stadium recently, the stadium was shuffled off to another entity within the owner's empire without us noticing that coming through the official channels. So one still has to be wary.
No, indeed, and I think the fans are right to be worried about these things. And when you look at the more broadly at the issues that affect clubs, I think it's the lack of scrutiny of what the owners are doing. Most clubs are run as private businesses. Even unlike a company listed on the stock exchange would have to have far more disclosure about its finances and reporting that a football club does. But nevertheless, football clubs are big businesses with high turnovers, but we've allowed them to be run like small private businesses with no real oversight and not even by the football authorities themselves to make sure their own rules are being followed. And that's why I think for clubs that are in distress and require bailout support, if that has to come from the state, we could do that. But with that needs to be real change that will stop this happening again.
Yeah, I quite agree with that point because, like we've seen, you talk about club accounts and the EFL not having a clue what some clubs are doing with money. And, Oldham Athletics, a prime example, I think they posted a profit in the last set of accounts of 6 million, yet it's phantom. It's fantasy. There's no way they made a profit of 6 million. It's creative accountancy at best. I won't say what I think at worst, but I think what is important is that kind of intervention, so a government loan coming in, being given up in terms of equity in the club, that's the only way it will work. You can't give loans to football club owners without having some sort of oversight that allows you access to accounts and some controlling interest in that club. And I think that's something that needs addressing. Peter, is there anything else you'd want to bring to this argument as a fan of a club that's disappeared, or just as a football writer in general who keeps on top of these sort of things?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points, actually. Firstly, for opponents of any sort of state intervention in sport, the government themselves only last month pledged £16 million to rescue the rugby league. So there's already a cash injection in a different sport. So to safeguard the future of the clubs and the communities. I mean, obviously, rugby league is relatively small fry compared to the figures we've been discussing for football, but I don't remember any big vociferous opposition to that, personally. Secondly, I would just say League 1 and 2 especially, but Championship, I guess, as well. And I've said this countless times, particularly on this podcast, what's the main expenditure always? It's always on player transfer fees, possibly, but it's always on player salaries. So if there isn't a more equitable solution within the domestic game to, as in terms of redistributing wealth and the money sloshing around in it, which is mainly concentrated at the top, then it probably means that these clubs are going to have to cut quite savagely the salaries that they do pay, because there is no end date to this crisis. I mean, we might want and hope for the 2021 season to be starting later this year or maybe early next year, but there's just no guarantee of that. So, like Damian said, essentially, without spectators, football clubs, like some musicians, theatre, art, these are all basically dead entities for the time being. So, they just have to cut, unfortunately, they just have to cut costs as much as they can. In the meantime, when hopefully some support will come from this proposal or something similar, but until then, that's what they're just going to have to do. And that's not just a short-term thing for the coronavirus crisis. It's got to be a long-term ambition to keep them afloat if something like this happens again.
Well, I think a lot of chairmen would want a salary cap from the ones I've spoken to, and they'd want a salary cap not based on the turnover of each individual club, but actually a blanket one that will make it a lot fairer. And those clubs who have bigger incomes can still spend extra money on transfer fees, for example. But I don't know what your take on that, Damien, because I think that has to come in at some point, or nothing will improve drastically unless you do have a sort of salary cap or an evening out of the distributed funds.
It's difficult. I mean, if I could I just want to go back on what we talked earlier about, interfering in businesses, in clubs, in a way we wouldn't do in other businesses. I think there needs to be recognition that actually football's already quite different, because there is, and there's a kind of triple whammy that's affecting football at the moment, in that there's no income from gate receipts. There's a lack of finance to come into the clubs to help bail them out. And also, they can't do what other businesses would do, which is to restructure their debts. Because, as has been rightly said, most of their debts are football bills, which they have to pay in full under the football creditors rules. Under league rules, they have to pay the salaries of the players in full. They have to pay any outstanding transfer fees and other fees for other clubs in full. And therefore, they cannot do what other businesses around the country will be doing at this time, which is to go into administration, restructure their debts, come to a deal with their creditors and move on. Because the players and the other clubs can stand by the line and say, no, we've got to have our money in full. And they know that if the club doesn't pay it in full, they'll be kicked out of the league. And so these create these massive additional pressures. On salary caps, for me, I think it's about financial sustainability. So is the club can the club afford to pay its bills in a sustainable basis without soft loans and other short-term finance that may not be sustainable? And I think there are some clubs that have got bigger fan bases, much higher levels of match day revenue, can afford to pay players more. And I don't think those clubs should be artificially constrained by saying, well, you can't do it, even though you can afford to do it. So I think what we need to do is say, based just as the financial fair play rules are, and other rules are, to say, and the salary protocol is designed to do is to set that level at a sustainable level. But what is absent is the proper enforcement of those rules, and that's what I think. For me, that is the important step that needs to be taken, rather than saying, well, let's just have a blanket salary cap. Because, I mean, salary caps work in things like the NFL in America, where you've got a series of franchises, clubs that are all commercially roughly the same sort of size, and therefore it just creates a level playing field in the way the competition is run. But I think in a league like League One, I think there are massive disparities in the size and the fan bases of the clubs. So I'm not sure it would be the right mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily going to agree with that. I mean, I think the loopholes need to be closed before anything else happens, because at the moment, you may have the correct rules in place and they may be enforced, but as we've heard, if there's a loophole that allows you to get around them, then they're kind of pointless, really. And they'll end up leading to more and more clubs getting into financial distress, which of course is not what we want. So I have got a few questions from people on Twitter, which I will like to put to you. I mean, Tom Reed has asked about your plan. It mentions a move towards a German model as one of the benefits. Do you see a 50+1 model as a good fit for the lower leagues in the medium term, and i.e. members owning the controlling interest and space for investment? Is that good for clubs?
I think it could be. I mean, we're not seeking to impose it as a structure, but as we talked about earlier on, the initial bailout would be for a minority stake, but then if that stake was acquired by the community could seek to increase its shareholding in the club, obviously by buying shares off of the owner, or if the club or if the current owner required further financial assistance, then again, the controllers of that community stake would be in a very strong position to, put that finance in return for taking over the club. So I think it could create a pathway for some clubs where that could be the route they go down. And I think, as I said earlier on, because these clubs, they don't, as the virus is demonstrating, the clubs that are reliant on gate receipts to survive, season ticket sales to survive, and support from local businesses to survive, they don't really have unless they have the community with them, they don't really exist. They're not financially viable. So I think it does pose a perfectly reasonable question, which is to say, well, the German model could work very well in that case, because then the community whose funds keep the club going has got more of an oversight in how the club's being run.
One thing I'd put to Roger, because you work a lot with Supporters Trust, would they be in a position to take over a stake in the club once the club is in a better financial position and the stake that the government had could be sold back to them?
I think there is an issue of scale with Supporters Trusts, and whether they can operate further up than halfway down League One, I'm not yet sure. We've seen the examples of both Portsmouth and Swansea, where success has led to the supporters giving up their golden shares in those clubs in favour of greater financial investment. When you get to, the Championship and you get 20,000 people in every week, you need quite a big Supporters Trust operation with a lot of, bought-in expertise to make that work. And I think it's interesting when you talk about lower division clubs, we have to remember that, for instance, Portsmouth, Hull, Swansea and Bournemouth have played in all four divisions in the last 15 years, each of them. So, the clubs do move up and down quite rapidly within the system. The German model, I think, one would like to see it in the UK, but it needs a bit more than the strength of many existing supporters' trusts to make that work. I'm not entirely convinced they can make it work on their own.
No, and that is one of the things that would have to probably be addressed about how that government stake would be sold come the end of come to the point when it does get sold. In fact, Wiseman Say podcast, a Sunderland podcast, they've put the question. They said they'd be incredibly uncomfortable having any of the club used as collateral for a government loan. They said, who dictates the market value when the time comes to buy the government out? A cynic might suggest this is a land grab.
Well, I think the buyout of the stake in the club would really be a question of the government seeking to recoup the money that had been spent on it. So I don't think we'll probably be looking at the clubs going up in value very much during that period of time. So it's there to stabilise the club and there has to be an assessment made as to also the value of the loan versus the stake that will be taken as well. So that again has to be based on a valuation of the club. But I mean, valuations are made commercially for clubs that are bought and sold all the time. If anything, certainly for clubs in League 1 and League 2, it's been a bit of a buyer's market because my understanding is there are quite a few clubs that are on the market for purchase and have been for a while that people aren't interested in buying. So, and I certainly don't see it as a kind of land grab. I don't think the government will have an interest in acquiring football clubs and running them. I think it's simply a mechanism to say that, as I think the government, I think is being discussed considering other businesses, is a way of saying financial support to come with strings attached. It might be better if that came in the form of a shareholding in that business rather than in the form of a loan.
Indeed. Another question from another Sunderland fan is Chris. One thing we've had echoed to us across social media is the involvement of Charlie Methven in this. There is a consensus that people think this kind of undermines all the proposal because he is currently a vested interest in the game with Sunderland, and some of his decisions at the club have been questionable, perhaps. Chris has asked the question, could you ask Damian how having Charlie Methven as a co-sponsor doesn't undermine the proposals, given that he is part of a regime that stripped a considerable amount of money out of Sunderland? Does he know what a fair price for Charlie Methven's 6% stake, which he got for nothing, would be for Sunderland fans to buy it?
So I'm not in a position to answer questions about the finances of Sunderland, and Charlie Methven's involvement in this is because, well, firstly, I've known Charlie for a very long time, and we started talking about the urgent need for a plan to save football clubs that were in dire financial straits. I came at that from my experience having chaired the select committee, and indeed the select committee visited Sunderland shortly after Charlie and the new owners took over the club as part of a visit we were doing to the city. And I think what Charlie brought to the framing of these ideas and what was in the article that we wrote was the insight of someone who sits in these meetings with other club owners, club chairmen, discussing the very real issues, financial issues that they face. And as someone who, his life career has not been in football, it's been in other forms of business, and he came into football administration with that business background. So I think it was, in terms of developing those ideas, I think his insights were incredibly useful. I don't think that, it's certainly, he's not part of the solution in that we're not suggesting he's not part of delivering the solution. He's what he did in cooperating with me on writing these proposals was bring the insights of someone with direct experience of being a co-owner of a League One club now. And I think those insights were helpful, certainly in understanding just how urgent and severe this crisis is.
Yeah, I think I can understand that from that perspective. Salopcast, who is a Shrewsbury Town podcast, they have asked, do you believe chairman will allow encroachment of their powers? And he's asked, do you think someone like Charlie Methven or indeed any other owner of a club would let an independent director look at their finances?
Well, this is a voluntary scheme. And so there will be clubs that can sort out their own affairs. And that's fine. They're free to do that. We're not seeking to impose this on anyone. But what this would be, though, is a route to, sustainability and potentially the only way in which the finances could be secured to keep the club going. And therefore, it's up to clubs to make that decision. And I think a club chairman faced with, losing their club and the club being kicked out of the league and rendered worthless, or accepting this injection of cash from the only organisation that would provide it. Well, I think that becomes a much clearer choice then. And I'm sure people have always got views as to what they'd ideally like to see, but ultimately, if a club is in distress, it comes down to whether they can secure the financing to keep that club going. And if they can't, then they have to make compromises. They'd have to make that if they were borrowing money commercially, and they know if they came to this new authority, there would be strings attached to that money as well.
Indeed. Well, before we go, Roger, anything else you'd like to add or ask Damian?
Yes, I've not really thought this one through, but does setting up the Football Finance Authority actually need the consent of the Football League clubs and their chairman, or can you just do it anyway, and those that want to take money from it under those conditions can do so.
Well, it's an interesting question actually. If the money could be loaned and in return for the equity stakes, so that's a transaction between, in effect, then the authority is just like any other organisation you might go to, seeking financial support, and that's the condition they attach to it. So rather than borrowing money, you're selling a stake in your club to a third party. So that doesn't require the consent of the football league in that way, unless they considered the authority was in some sort of improper organisation. Mm-hmm. The question then, in terms of it would fail the owners and directors test as an investor or a part owner. But given the way it applies that test, I think it's pretty unlikely they will make that decision. Then the issue down the line would be really whether if the authority was then in a position of publicly calling out clubs that were trading in breach of the league's rules, would the league act? I think it would then put the league in quite a difficult position to not to be seen to be responding to the advice of this authority in that way. And indeed, I think the more clubs that access support in this way and were required to report to the authority in this way might start to question why other league clubs don't do the same, either to the league or to someone else. So I think it could be set up as an external body, and it would develop. I think it would develop as more its role and its power would develop as more and more clubs became part of it. And I've heard, indeed, people within football say that actually, in some ways, the Football League might be quite grateful for this sort of role of financial regulation and oversight to be taken on by somebody else, because given the politics of the Football League as a members club with 72 members, the chairman of all the clubs, trying to do it internally is quite hard.
Yeah, as we are seeing at the moment.
I'm just thinking, David, you've got two herds of very difficult cats to try and organise in 3 or 4 months. And if you can cut that down to one herd, i.e. the parliamentarians or whoever needs to be on side from a governmental point of view, then you're kind of halving your problem.
Indeed, and as anyone who's ever had a cat knows, the one way you can get a cat to do what you want is to feed it.
Yeah. Peter, is there anything that you'd like to ask Damian before we round this up?
Just quite a simple question, really. From his point of view, does he foresee a medium to long-term future in how the EFL is currently governing the second, third, and fourth tiers of football from a financial oversight aspect?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think and I think this is about probably the whole football pyramid, professional football pyramid in England and Wales, which is, we've got a lot of clubs in League One and League Two that in some ways are like bigger versions of the clubs that are in the National Conference. There are probably half a dozen or so clubs in League One at the moment, maybe a few more, who are, really Championship or Premier League clubs, former, clubs in those divisions who are more like the clubs above them. And is the same model, the same governance model, good for all, or should it be different? And I think I think what coronavirus may do, I think certainly without the financial support we've suggested, is it may hasten that change where actually the number of clubs that are engaged full time in the professional structure of football becomes much smaller, and the smaller clubs, become more like the sort of clubs we'd see in the conference. And I think that this financial crisis may accelerate that process. But I do think the structures we have in place at the moment, I don't think look that fit for purpose, and I could easily see down the line there being a case for a bigger governance reform of the way football competitions are run. And I still think too that when you've got, I think not many people just look at the football, the tables published online, the football tables or in the newspapers, and they think, well, it's all football clubs playing under the aegis of the FA. In what looks like one competition, but obviously it's two totally separate competitions in the Premier League and the Football League that are becoming increasingly different. And the financial success of the Premier League is also having a distorting effect on the rest of the football pyramid as well. So I don't think this is a sustainable model. And what we've proposed may be a good way to transition to a new model by at least getting the clubs in Leagues 1 and Leagues 2 into a more sustainable financial position.
Indeed, let's hope that actually happens. We've heard a lot of talk before, but I think a lot of fans will hold their breath until they actually see change take place.
So I'd say I can totally understand that, but I think the one thing that's different this time is that there is a financial lever potentially, because if this fund is the only way in which clubs can be saved, then that's a way of driving change. And we've not had that opportunity before, because the football authority has been able to ignore outside pressure because they've not needed that kind of support, but now they might.
They might indeed, and I think you might be right. They might need it sooner rather than later. Gentlemen, thank you very much for agreeing to join me on this podcast. Damian, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
If you've liked this podcast, please give it a retweet and give it a share. And we'll be back midweek with another interview, this time of David Sharp, Director of Football of Mansfield. So stay tuned for that one. But until then, everyone, take care.